Hello YouTube. You may have clicked on this video thinking that this was some joke question or random clickbait. Well, it really should be a complete joke to ask, would you rather be conquered by a Mongol or a Christian? No one would reasonably want to be conquered by anyone. The reason why I am posing such a silly question is in response to a silly question that was proposed by Prager University. They made a video titled, Would you rather be colonized by Aztecs or Christians? Seems like a silly question, but the good people at Prager U take it very seriously. I will leave a link to their video in the description. Go check it out for the full context of my response. Their video goes to show how being colonized by Christians is much better than being colonized by Aztecs. Michael Knowles, the host of PragerU's video, begins by claiming the left has divided the world into colonizers and the colonized. He argues that this created the term settler colonialism to describe the modern social order created by the West through colonialism. This, according to Knowles, is all to take the land away from the current occupants and give it back to the previous occupants of the land. He goes on to use the Black Hills as an example of how this can go wrong. The Supreme Court ordered the U.S. government to pay the Lakota for the land, but did not give it back to the Lakota. He claims that giving it back or even paying for it now would raise more questions because the Lakota had previously taken the land from other native peoples. So who is rightful owners, and is there any of those people alive today to claim it? Knowles explains that for most of history, nations believed in the right of conquest. The conqueror has the right to the land until they lose it through force. He does not delve into the issues of this theory or what it could mean for modern nations. Completely ignoring the possible issues with the right of conquest, he moves on to why humans conquer. At first, Knowles admits the true reason for conquest, power and material benefit. But then he claims that a higher power, i.e., God, was a major motivator of the colonization of the Americas. He thinks that the fact that some of these ventures were unsuccessful in being profitable somehow proves that they were motivated by higher ideals rather than material benefit or power. His argument for the Pilgrims seems to support his claim. However, it can be argued that the Pilgrims settled in the Americas so that they could create their own pilgrim nation and stay separate from other religious groups. They sought control of a new land for themselves and only themselves. Knowles claims that they did it for a higher power in spreading the gospel of Christ. The real pilgrims did not care about spreading the gospel. They were separatists. They wanted to isolate themselves from the world, and they saw colonization as a way to do it. His other examples are easily refuted as working for a higher power and not for material benefit and power. He says that Washington and Jefferson lost much of their wealth through the War of Independence and later working for the government. Not gaining material wealth does not mean that they were not trying to get wealth. Washington attempted to illegally take valuable land in Ohio before independence, but was unable to claim it because settlers had already moved onto the land before the U.S. won the War of Independence. Other founding fathers were smugglers and involved in illegal economic enterprises before independence. Just because some were unsuccessful does not mean that material wealth was not a major motivation. The worst examples were the Spanish conquistadors, who were clearly seeking gold and fame by conquering the so-called New World. Any belief that they were motivated by God and spreading the word of God is a misreading of history at best. The Spanish sought wealth and power in the Americas to propel their position back in Europe as a major continental power. His final points are about the Aztecs and how the Christians are better colonizers. Since the Aztecs were conquerors that sacrificed human prisoners, the Christians were better colonizers. Instead of asking, should we colonize and conquer, he asks, would you rather be colonized by Christians or Aztecs? As a response to their video, I would like to ask a different silly question. Would you rather be conquered by Mongols or Christians? I will be using the same premise that Prager U uses. We will assume that might makes right. The right of conquest will not be questioned because they defended it in the original video. So, ignoring the question of is it right to conquer the majority of the Eurasian landmass and all moral questions surrounding conquest itself, we can begin my proposed scenario. So, if you were a commoner whose land had just been taken by a conquering power, would you rather it be by a Christian or a Mongol? First, let's examine a Christian conqueror. It would depend on when and where for a full understanding of what type of conquest we might be facing, but some things happen almost every time a Christian leader conquered non Christian land. For most of the medieval period, Christian conquest outside of Christendom was marked by crusader zeal. The Christians conquered the Holy Land for a short time. They crusaded in northern and eastern Europe against Slavic and Scandinavian pagans and reconquered Iberia from the Islamic caliphs. The largest crusades were to conquer the Holy Land, and when successful, the Christians did not spare civilians. In Jerusalem, the successful crusaders slew everyone in the city. Muslim, Jew, and even Christians were killed by the crusading army in their frenzy after taking the city. The aim of the crusade was to drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land. The Christians did not want to live in harmony with those of other faiths. They wanted to dominate the land and convert the Holy Land to be a Christian-only kingdom. In Eastern and Northern Europe, the crusading zeal fought against the pagans. The Teutonic Knights fought to convert the Baltic peoples, most notably the Lithuanians, and led brutal conquests of the region. The Crusades in Europe are not as well remembered as those in the Holy Land, but they were just as brutal and led to the extermination of the European pagan faiths. The Spanish Reconquista is a well-known event, much like the Spanish Inquisition that followed. The Spanish reconquest of Iberia led to the zealous purge of Islamic and Jewish culture, influence, and people from the land that they had lived in for centuries. Under the Islamic rulers, the three faiths could live in relative harmony and work together to advance knowledge in many fields. The Spanish Reconquista ended this relationship, and the Spanish monarchs persecuted non-Christians. Spain became a Christian nation by purging all non-Christians from the land. European Christian colonization continued the crusading ideal in new places. While they were not called crusades, the same belief that Christianity needed to convert, by force if necessary, the native populations was the state policy. In the Americas, the policy of conversion and destruction of native culture took on many different faces and policies, but the goals were always the same. The natives had to convert or be destroyed. But sometimes, even if they did convert, they still needed to be pushed out to the edges of society. In Latin America, for the most part, the native populations were forced to convert and became meshed with the culture of their Spanish conquerors. Pockets of natives, especially in the South American jungles, stayed independent, but attempts were made to force them to convert or to destroy them. In Northern America, what has become Canada and the US, there were attempts to convert the First Nations or to destroy them outright. Besides conquest and forcing the natives to move westward, one of the largest policies was the Indian boarding schools. Both the US and Canada used these to take native children away from their tribes and force them to become Christianized and to lose all elements of their native culture. Even speaking their native language was strictly forbidden. Today, this would be considered genocide by the UN resolutions. This is a form of systematic extermination of an entire culture. Even in the scramble for Africa, the European states used churches as a way to subjugate the African peoples. Churches were used to break up African communities and make them easier for control by the home governments. The legacy of Christian colonization in Africa is still clear in the political climate in sub-Saharan Africa today. It is clear that Christians saw conquest and conversion as going hand in hand. Christians wanted to destroy the native cultures and religions and create a global Christendom. States used this zeal to divide natives in non-Christian communities against themselves and make them easier to conquer. Being conquered by a Christian meant that your culture and identity would be destroyed. So, what would it be like to live under a Mongol Khan? First of all, the Mongols did not have a strong administration or a strong desire to convert the conquered peoples to their culture and religion. Genghis Khan never pursued Tengri conversion as a policy, and he and his descendants were often tolerant of other faiths. After the initial conquest, Mongol leaders did not care much about the administration or the religion of their subjects so long as they received their tributes. This resulted in an empire that may not have been Mongol, but was Chinese, Persian, or Central Asian, with the Mongol dynasty. This trend was expressed more in some locations than others because the absorptive power of the various civilizations differed in intensity. In China, for instance, the Mongols could maintain their rule better than elsewhere because the strong Chinese tradition of centralized state power supplied a stable framework of governmental organization. Different Khans took different policies for their realms, and many converted to the religion and culture of the conquered people. This led to a strange blend of cultures and religions in the Mongol Empire. One Khan, Mongke, was a benevolent monarch and continued Guyuk's policy of universal tolerance toward all religions. In his reign, the capital, Karakorum, reached a splendor which reflected the vastness of the empire. A European guest at the court in January 1254, the French friar Willem van Rooisbroek left an interesting account of the Mongol capital, where Christian churches, Muslim mosques, and Buddhist temples flourished, and envoys from the whole known world met. Over time, the strange dynamic of the conquerors being absorbed into cultures of the conquered culminated in Kublai Khan's rule over China. When he was the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, Kublai came to regard himself as a Chinese emperor more than anything else. And similarly, the other dominions developed on lines which were less and less Mongol. This tendency may be regarded as concomitant with the conversion of various Khans to other religions, chiefly Islam and Buddhism. In Kublai's case, this conversion from Mongol to Chinese civilization was insinuated by the transfer of his capital to Beijing, which he began to rebuild in 1267. Mongolia was no longer the real center of the empire, not even of Kublai's dominions. Kublai Khan's reign was also strange for how he treated those he conquered. Contrary to former custom, he treated the deposed imperial family well and forbade his generals from resorting to indiscriminate slaughter. He created a Chinese dynasty and saw himself as a Chinese emperor rather than a Mongol Khan. The leaders of the Mongol Empire, integrating into the cultures and religions of the conquered peoples, is vastly different to the style of conquest by European Christians. In Mongol China, the influence of Chinese culture made itself more and more felt at court and among some of the Mongol nobility. Though other Mongols remained hostile to everything Chinese, the last emperor, Togon Temur, had become emperor at the age of 13. He had received the rudiments of a Chinese education and was, like some of his predecessors, a pious Buddhist and a benevolent though weak ruler. Over the century of Mongol rule, Chinese literary life remained remarkably free, perhaps because the ruling minority was indifferent to or even unable to read what their subjects wrote in Chinese. It is surprising to see how freely Chinese writers after 1280 expressed their national, loyalist, and anti Mongol feelings. This is again a major difference from the normal experience of conquest, where the conquered peoples lose their rights and culture, or at least are forced to adapt to a new hybrid culture. In the end of Mongol rule in China, it may safely be said that Chinese civilization as a whole was influenced surprisingly little by Mongol rule. This was similar in other parts of the vast Mongol empires. The Mongols conquered Christians in Eastern Europe. Unlike the Teutons, the Mongols did not attempt to convert the Slavic population. Instead of forced conversions, the Khans observed tolerance towards the Orthodox Church and their Russian subjects. The patriarchs enjoyed a number of privileges not unlike those granted by the Khans in China. For the most part, the Russians were left on their own by the Mongol Khans. In the various Russian city states and princedoms that remained under Mongol rule, the Khans contented themselves with levying tribute. So now we can see what it is like to be conquered by a Christian or a Mongol. Christians saw their mission to convert the world, even if it meant by force. The Mongols may have been more brutal on the initial conquest, but they did not see religious or cultural conversion as necessary for their subjects. In fact, many Khans converted to the religions of the people they ruled, and some adopted non Mongol languages and cultures. It is clear that for the conquered, the Mongols were by far the better option. Instead of losing their religion, culture, homelands, the conquerors assimilated into their culture. The Mongols, in some ways, connected Eurasia, while Christians divided and destroyed cultures all over the world. While the question is absurd and the argument for the right of conquest is weak, it is clear that the West cannot take a mantle of being the best conquerors outright. If I were to be conquered, I would rather be conquered by Mongols than Christians. It is clear that Prager U uses quick videos with questionable logic and facts to paint a picture of the West being superior. In reality, history is far more complex, and instead of trying to posture ourselves as morally superior, we should try to learn from the good and bad of history and use those lessons to build a better future. That should be the goal of studying history, to learn from our past, not to try to use it to glorify ourselves.